The Fear Factory Stories.
I thought I had seen it all when it came to my job, but that night at the morgue changed everything. You see, I had only just started working there. It was my first day out of training, and they trusted me to be alone. I figured it would be an easy shift, just a few hours at the morgue in a small town outside of Austin, Texas. But I had no idea how wrong I was. On my way to work, I made a decision that would haunt me. I stopped by a guy selling weed. Not my usual source, just some random guy on the corner. I figured a little blunt would help me relax before my shift. It was around 2 p.m. when I arrived at the morgue, and at first, everything seemed normal. The place had the usual smell, that mix of chemicals and something else you never quite get used to. There were a few bodies there waiting to be processed. I hated the smell, but I'd learned to live with it. I was working on a body when I heard a low moan behind me. I froze for a second. I knew that sometimes bodies release air, and it can make noises, so I tried to brush it off. I turned around slowly, and there it was. The man on the table, his eyes wide open, staring right at me. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself this was normal. I'd read enough about post-mortem reflexes to know it could happen. But it didn't end there. It was getting dark outside, and a storm started brewing. Rain began to pour, and I swear it felt like I was in one of those horror movies. My anxiety started to spike, so I decided to take a break. I had the munchies, so I grabbed a bag of chips and sat down to calm myself. That's when I heard it again, a noise coming from the hallway. I thought I was alone, but the sound stopped me cold. I felt a chill run down my spine. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had to check it out, even though every instinct in me was screaming to stay put. Slowly I walked to the hallway. I turned the corner and froze. At the far end of the hallway, I saw one of the bodies standing there. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, thinking maybe the weed was messing with my mind, but the body started to move, walking toward me. I backed up, rubbing my eyes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, just like that, the figure disappeared. I stood there trying to breathe, trying to figure out what was happening. And then, every single door in the building flung open at once, slamming against the walls, followed by this terrible, eerie laughter that echoed through the halls. I didn't think twice. I ran. I ran out of there so fast I almost tripped over my own feet. I called my boss from the parking lot, my hands shaking, my voice trembling. He laughed it off and said he'd come check it out. When he arrived, he walked through the building while I sat in my car, still shaking. He found nothing out of the ordinary, but I knew what I saw, what I heard. Maybe it was the weed. Maybe I was just too stressed. But the fear I felt was real. That night, I quit right on the spot. I never smoked again, and I never stepped foot in a morgue after that. I've worked the night shift at many morgues in my career, but nothing compares to what happened in that small town in Louisiana. I had been a forensic doctor for over 15 years, and I thought I'd seen it all, until the night they brought in the old woman. She arrived late, wrapped in a dirty sheet, her body in a state of severe decomposition. The team who brought her in said she had been dead for weeks in her house, unnoticed. She had no family, no friends, just a lonely old woman from the outskirts of town. I was used to dealing with death. It's part of the job, but there was something about her, something that immediately made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My colleague Ben and I went through the usual procedures. We performed the autopsy and completed the paperwork. But as we worked, the room seemed to get colder, the air thicker. Ben mentioned feeling dizzy, and I wasn't feeling too great myself. We brushed it off, blaming the long hours, the dim lights, the claustrophobic feel of the place. We finished our work and placed the old woman in one of the cold chambers, making sure to lock the heavy metal door. We took a break to get some coffee. The room was silent except for the hum of the refrigeration units. but there was an unsettling weight in the air. Just as we were finishing our coffee, we heard it, the unmistakable creak of a door opening. Ben and I exchanged a look. We both knew where the sound had come from. We walked cautiously back to the cold room. The door to the old woman's chamber was wide open, swinging slowly on its hinges. Ben turned to me, his face pale. "Did you lock it?" he asked. I nodded, my heart racing. I had locked it. I was sure of it. We decided to close the door again and check the lock, thinking it was just old or faulty. We went back to our break room, but the unease stayed with us. Ben went to the bathroom a few minutes later. That's when I heard him shout my name, his voice echoing down the hall. I rushed over to find him standing outside the bathroom, his eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" I asked. He pointed to the bathroom mirror, his hand trembling. "I saw her," he whispered. "The old woman. She was right there, staring at me from the reflection." I tried to calm him down, told him it must have been a trick of the light or his mind playing tricks. But deep down I felt it too, that cold, creeping fear that something was very wrong. I told Ben to take the night off and that I would cover for him. After he left, I went back to the cold room, trying to shake off the fear. I needed to get back to work, but I couldn't stop thinking about what Ben had seen. As I checked on the new bodies, the lights flickered, and then out of nowhere I saw her. The old woman sitting on one of the stretchers, her head tilted slightly, a sinister grin spreading across her face. I froze. For a moment I couldn't move. Then she laughed, a deep, throaty laugh that sent chills down my spine. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was outside, breathing hard in the cool night air. The next day I spoke to some of the locals. They told me the old woman was no ordinary recluse. She was rumored to be a witch, a woman who practiced dark magic. People avoided her, said she had made a pact with the devil himself. I knew we couldn't leave her body there. So that night, we decided to cremate her, to rid the morgue of whatever was haunting us. After her body was turned to ashes, the morgue returned to normal. The cold, heavy feeling lifted, and peace returned. But I never forgot the old woman's smile, or the way she seemed to defy death itself. Some things can't be explained, and some spirits refuse to rest.
It was a quiet, foggy night at the morgue, one of those nights where the silence felt too thick, too heavy. I had just started my shift, going through the usual motions. I've been a forensic doctor for a few years now in a small town just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and I thought I'd grown used to the eerie stillness that comes with working the graveyard shift. But that night felt different, like something was lingering in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Around 2 a.m., they brought in a young girl, maybe 19 or 20, who had been killed in a car accident. Her face was bruised, and her body was battered. I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. She was so young, with a life that had barely started. I did the usual paperwork and placed her body on a stretcher, preparing for the autopsy. A little while later, I needed a break and headed to the small break room for some stale coffee. The security guard, James, was at his post by the front door, but I could hear him talking to someone. His voice was calm, almost soothing, as if he were giving directions to a lost child. I stepped out to see who it was, but when I got there, he was alone. I asked, "Who were you talking to?" James turned to me, looking a little confused. "A girl," he replied. "She said she was lost and asked if I could help her find her way home. She seemed disoriented, like she didn't know where she was." I frowned. "A girl? Here, at this hour?" He nodded. "Yeah, but she walked off when I tried to help. I figured she might have left." Something about it didn't sit right with me, but I shrugged it off and went back to work. About an hour later, as I was checking on the bodies, I heard a loud thud from the cold room. I rushed over and saw that the young girl's body had fallen off the stretcher. It didn't make sense. She had been placed securely, and there was no one else in the room. My heart was racing as I called James over to help me lift her back up, but when he walked in and saw her, he froze. His face went white as a sheet, and he took a step back. "That's her," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's the girl who asked me for help." I stared at him, feeling a chill run down my spine. "Are you sure?" He nodded slowly, his eyes wide with fear. "I'm sure. It was her." Right down to the same tattoo on her arm. A cold shiver ran through me as I realized what had happened. The girl's spirit was confused, lost, not knowing she had already crossed over. She was just trying to find her way home, unaware that home was no longer a place she could go. James and I stood there for a long moment, both of us too stunned to speak. Eventually, we lifted her back onto the stretcher and quietly left the room. As I walked out, I felt a mix of fear and sadness. I had never encountered anything like this before, and I didn't know if I ever would again. But one thing was clear: not every soul is ready to leave this world, even when it's their time.
It was supposed to be just another quiet night shift. I had been working as a medical assistant at a small hospital in Seattle, Washington, for about a year. I was young, inexperienced, and completely skeptical about anything that didn't have a logical explanation. Ghosts? Paranormal activity? Those were just stories people told around campfires. One evening, I was chatting with Mark, a colleague who had done his service in the same hospital years ago. He gave me a half smile and warned, "The night shift here is different. You might see or hear things, but don't let it get to you. Just keep doing your job." I laughed it off, thinking he was trying to spook the rookie. But a few nights later, something happened that still makes my skin crawl. The doctor on duty asked me to check the morgue and confirm the number of bodies there. I remember feeling a chill as I walked down the long, dimly lit hallway. A few of the fluorescent lights were flickering, giving the whole place an eerie vibe. It was a government-run hospital, so maintenance wasn't exactly a priority. The cold room was at the far end, where the light barely reached. I pushed the door open and stepped into the cold, musty air. There were 5 bodies lying under white sheets. I started counting them one by one, but as I got to the 3rd one, I noticed something from the corner of my eye. One of the bodies, covered with a blanket, seemed to have turned its head in my direction. My heart pounded as I glanced over, but I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I took a deep breath and kept going. I covered the body back up and continued counting. That's when I heard it. A low, anguished cry of a man echoing through the room. It was so clear, so desperate that my body froze. I didn't even need to turn around to know where it came from. Within seconds, I was running down the hallway, my footsteps echoing louder than my racing heartbeat. When I reached the doctor's office, I was pale, breathless, and shaking. I could barely speak. The doctor looked at me for a moment, his expression unreadable, but I could tell he knew. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. I wanted dawn to come so badly, just so I could leave and never look back. But I had to keep coming back night after night to finish my service. And over the next few months, more strange things happened. But I'll save those stories for another time.
I've always believed that a hospital can be one of the most haunted places in the world. I didn't think much of it when I got a job at a hospital in Chicago, Illinois. It was just a new chapter for me, a chance to do what I love. Taking care of people had always been my passion, and this job was perfect. Except for one thing. I worked on the oncology floor, the cancer ward. It's one of the hardest floors to work on. We often have the same patients for months, and not many of them make it. You'd think I'd be used to death by now, but every time it happens, it's still tough. I've seen my fair share of it since I started, and I'm not easily rattled, but there's something about the morgue that always gives me the creeps, especially on night shifts. One night, it was my turn to take a patient down to the morgue. I asked my coworker Maggie to come with me. Our hospital morgue is in the basement, and it's not just any morgue. It's this tiny, freezing cold box that smells like something died in there ages ago. No pun intended. And there's this old ramp you have to push the gurney up to get inside. So Maggie and I wheeled the body down, struggling a bit as we pushed it up the ramp. Then came the usual debate about who had to push the body inside. Of course I lost. I laughed it off, took a deep breath, swung open the heavy freezer door, and pushed the body in. As soon as the door slammed shut, we both heard it. A faint sound. At first I thought it was the freezer's cooling unit kicking in, but then it got louder. A soft, muffled cry. Maggie looked at me, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my heart thudding in my chest. We turned to look at the door, and for a moment I felt every hair on my body stand up. It was like someone was crying, sobbing from deep within that cold box. Neither of us moved. We just stood there, staring at the door, chills running down our spines. Without a word, we turned and ran. We didn't stop until we were halfway down the hall. Maggie grabbed my arm, her voice shaking. "You heard it too, right?" she asked. I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "Yeah, I heard it, clear as day." The next day, I told another nurse on our floor about what happened. She just smiled knowingly and said, "Oh yeah, the morgue? It happens all the time. To this day, I refuse to go down there alone. I always find some excuse to get out of it." We even have this tradition on our floor now. Whenever someone passes away, we open a window to let their soul out so it doesn't get trapped in the hospital, roaming the hall forever. You can think I'm crazy, but I swear on everything. It happened. Believe me or not, I know what I heard. And so does everyone else who works here.